My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Is there evidence of the continuity of consciousness after physical death? How might that evidence bring comfort to the bereaved, especially parents who have lost children? My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Mark Ireland, sought this evidence after the passing of his youngest son. He was able to connect with his son's essence and observed a variety of phenomena supporting the survival hypothesis. This led him on a profound personal journey and deep dive into psychic medium phenomena, spirit visitations, afterlife communication, reincarnation, and near-death experiences, pointing to the post-mortem survival of consciousness. Mark is also co-founder of Helping Parents Heal, an organization with 24,000 members that assist bereaved parents worldwide. His website is markirelandauthor.com, and he joins me this week to share his path and latest book, Persistence of the Soul, Mediums, Spirit Visitations, and Afterlife Communication. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited, Mark Ireland. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, it's great to be here, Victor. Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a message that I think is so important for so many. So let's start by asking you, what motivated you to investigate and write about mediumship and afterlife evidence?
Well, actually, unlike a lot of folks in my position, I grew up with a father who was a pretty prominent psychic and medium. His prominence was from the 50s through the 80s primarily. And so I saw this phenomena in daily life where, the psychic part of it, you couldn't get away with anything at home. And then, in his own church, where he would demonstrate these abilities, I guess, as validation of the gifts of the spirit. And then in secular venues as well, doing psychic demonstrations, but also periodically having spirit communication pop through. So as a young kid, I saw this. So I looked at this and said, there is something more. I don't understand exactly how it works, but clearly when people die, they still exist in some form and can communicate. So having grown up like that, I didn't necessarily want to be my dad or like him, who wants to be their parent anyhow when they grow up. So I took a more conventional path. I went to college, got a degree, got married at a young age, and had a couple of kids, and was just kind of going down the normal American lifestyle kind of thing, and with career as the focus. And but unexpectedly, my 18-year-old son passed, and it was a day when he was going to go on a hike on the mountains in the McDowell Mountains in Scottsdale, Arizona, which was behind our home. And I had an uneasy feeling, almost like a premonition feeling, and tried to talk him out of going, but there was no stopping him. And he's like, the last words he ever said to me were, "We're going, Dad," implying stop your worrying, So he went on this hike with buddies, and he ended up, without dragging this out, he ended up passing away. His best friend had reported that Brandon, my son, had felt like his heart was beating rapidly and his arms were kind of numb. And then Stu tried to revive Brandon, but was unsuccessful. We were away from home at the time. We rushed back after getting a call. And by the time we got there, there were a horde of spectators, fire truck, ambulance, and helicopter. And we were informed within a short period of time that he had passed. So that's really what drew me back into it. By that point in my life, my dad had been gone for a number of years, about 12, I believe. But my uncle was still alive, and he had abilities similar to my father, and he's one of the first people I called. And I asked him, he asked if he could do anything to help me, and I just said, if you get any kind of message, I'd really appreciate it. And it was probably 3 days later when I was in the mortuary making arrangements that we connected by cell. And at that point, we had no cause of death. But my uncle said, Mark, I tried to connect last night and I couldn't get anything. But in my morning meditation today, your dad came to me. He wanted to let you know that he was there when Brandon passed. Brandon was a little confused at first, but your dad helped him adjust. Brandon wanted you to know that you're the best parents he ever could have had, which is the fuzzy, nice, warm thing we like to hear. But then he said, your dad said that Brandon's death was caused by a lack of oxygen in his bloodstream that caused his heart to fail. That was the evidence piece, because 2 days later, I got a call from the physician who had conducted the autopsy, and she told me that Brandon had suffered a severe asthma attack, which drove his blood oxygen levels down, causing cardiac arrest. So I got the cause of death 2 days before the autopsy results from my uncle through means other than physical examination. So that was really the starting point for what drew me back into the field.
Let's address a little bit more about your dad and your uncle. What was it like growing up with him? You had mentioned the fact that you didn't want to be like your dad, but what was it like having him in your life?
It was pretty wonderful. He was a gregarious person who people loved and followed. Some of them, he had people who tried to mooch off of him, I guess you would say. But he also, he was just very interesting. And having this ability is just one facet of him, because just as a human, he was just a very caring, loving person who gave to others. In fact, to a point where it was even frustrating to family members at times. He'd bring a stranger in off the street or whatever to stay with us for a while if someone was in distress or in a bad spot. So he really tried to live a Christ-like life, I guess, in many ways. Not that he was perfect by any means, but he was a good person, a caring person. It was very interesting, just to see how he would affect the lives of others. I remember one time walking into a living room when he had just done a reading for Amanda Blake, who played Miss Kitty on Gunsmoke. And she was just crying, but they were like happy tears. So I could tell she'd really been touched. My dad counseled other celebrities like Mae West. I got to meet her when I was 19 years old and tour her apartment, and I even have a card from Mamie Eisenhower from dated 1956, congratulating my dad on behalf of the president and her. That's when my parents got married. So it was just an interesting mix of his church, which was non-denominational. It was really a place where he called it the University of Life. He wanted to have it be a very open forum type of place, not really pushing forth a lot of dogma, but more letting people form their own opinions and views based on their experiences, and then demonstrating the abilities that he had. And then in secular venues, he branched out and did, TV shows, nightclubs, all kinds of things, demonstrating psychic phenomena to open people's minds to the possibility that we're more than just a brain and a body. So that was my dad, a very unique individual.
What were some of the most evidential stories you can share about your dad's abilities?
Sure. I'll tell you, I've had a lot of people come to me after the fact years later, and I'm putting these together in another book later on. I think one of the most startling that really twists your thinking about the nature of time and space comes from a woman named Norma Poling. So I was doing a talk a number of years ago, and she approached me and said, "Hey, Mark, I've got a story for you about your dad." She actually gave me a typewritten piece of paper with the whole story written, but then she told me the story. She said, "I first saw your dad in 1963. It was a psychic demonstration. And what he would do is take 10 strips of Johnson & Johnson white medical tape, which if anyone hasn't used that or seen it, it's extremely sticky. The adhesive is very strong, and it's completely, I believe, completely opaque. So he would take these strips, cover his eyes, and then put 3 black blindfolds over that, and then more tape over that down, covering the bottom of the blindfold so no one would think that he could see downward. It was really overkill." But then he would ask people to write questions on pieces of paper. Those would be collected by someone and then delivered to him in a basket. So this woman, Norma Poling, my dad was completely blindfolded at this point, or in the process of blindfolding, and she's trying to think about what to ask as a question. So she thought of two different possibilities. One was, will I have a fourth child, or will I get my master's degree? So she ended up just writing the one about the master's degree. She sent it up, and near the end, he had answered the question and said, yes, you're going to get your master's degree, which was great. She actually did get the master's degree. But then 5 years later, she went back to see him a second time and wrote an entirely new question. And when she sent it up, he later answered her and said, oh, Norma Poling, I see you had that fourth child. So that was a question she'd only thought of 5 years ago, but never wrote down.
Mm.
Pretty wild.
You have another example?
Sure. So this is one of my favorites, and people really like this one. So on one occasion, before I married my wife, actually on our second date, I was 19 years old. I went to pick her up, and I asked her if she'd like to go see my dad's demonstration. She said yes. So we went there, and I was running late. So by the time we got there, he was already blindfolded and giving messages to people. So I encouraged my wife to be, who was just my second date at the time, Susie, to write a question down. So she wrote, when will my mother get married? And at this time, her mom was divorced from her dad, but she had been dating a man for a number of years, but had been non-committal. So that's why she asked the question. So she sends that question up. And a bit later, my dad says, Susie Sap, Soup, Soap. And her last name was Sipe. And she says, here, this is me, And he says, I think you've asked me a question about your mother when she'll get married. Well, I don't know about your mother, my dear, but you've made your choice of men. He's with you tonight. Then I piped up and said, Dad, Susie's my date. He says, oh my gosh, I guess I just married off my own son.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. It's about a year and a half later we got married. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you. With reference to the Eisenhowers, did he actually do a reading for the Eisenhowers?
I can't say, because he was very secretive about some of those things. Over the years, I got the impression that he may have counseled other people in the government at different times, but he was tight-lipped about it. Maybe he had to be. I don't really know. I would have to assume that he must have counseled at least Mamie. I don't know if he counseled the president as well. Otherwise, how would she have known him, and why would she be sending him this card? So it's kind of a puzzle at this point, but my assumption here is that he must have counseled them because of that.
Now, you mentioned your father, obviously. You said that your uncle was also psychic. Were there other psychic people in your family?
Yeah, it does. I think a lot of people that research this field have determined that there seems, it follows family lines a lot of the time. My grandmother, my dad's mom, ended up being a trance medium. And then she founded her own church in Ashley, Ohio, which is a suburb of Columbus. And my dad's grandmother, I guess, read tea leaves back in the day. So it does follow suit. And I've had my own experiences. My dad always said I was very psychic. I never really viewed myself as such, because I felt like, how can I match with that, that standard? But I've had, when I've made an effort at it, I have, been able to produce some significant results. And oftentimes it's been more spontaneous, though, with me, because I've not really worked at it. But yes, it has gone through our family, and even on my mom's side a little bit too. My aunt was pretty psychic. My Aunt Gloria, my mom's sister, and my mom to some degree, I would say too. But I think in people, it varies the level of ability. And then the other part of it is, do they work to develop it or not?
Which of the clairs did your family share?
Oh, boy. Well, I think for my dad, it was a cross section of clairvoyance, clairaudience, telepathy. It was all of them. And I think that's what made his ability so strong. I'd say for the others, I can't really say, because I don't know that I asked my grandmother about that specifically. I can tell you, for me, when I've had it happen, it's really two different things. I would say it's clairvoyance for sure. I have to close my eyes. I'll give you an example. And this one's more personal. So really, even after my son Brandon passed, before I contacted my uncle, the first thing I did was I wanted a direct connection with my son. So I went into a darkened room, which is actually my walk-in closet, shut the door, and then just tried to quietly meditate. So my mind went pretty blank, And the first thing I visualized kind of in my mind's eye was my son Brandon glowing, like smiling, happy, but with a glow around him. And then right after that was a symbol, which was a cross with an oval loop at the top. At the time, I'd seen those, but I didn't know what they meant. So being somewhat analytical, I had to then go to Google, type in, cross with oval loop at top to find out that that's an Ankh, which is the oldest cross of human history, tied to the Egyptians, probably 5,000 years old or thereabouts, with the lower portion of the cross representing physical life and the oval loop representing eternal life. So what I got there was kind of a coded message that my son still existed and was happy and joyful. Had I already known what that symbol meant, then I could have second guessed it and said, well, that's my subconscious trying to comfort me. Now, in addition, I'd say, I guess you could call this clairaudience. I'm not really sure. I think the mediums I've interviewed who are clairaudient, very few of them actually hear in an auditory way through their ears. Some of them will hear in their mind, and some will just have like an idea pop in. So a few years ago, for a 3-year stint, I was speaking at this church in San Francisco. It was called the Golden Gate Spiritualist Church. It was founded in 1924 by a woman named Florence Becker, who, by all accounts, was similar to my father in abilities. She passed in, I believe, 1970. And when I did these talks over this 3-year stint, I was accompanied by Tina Powers, a really good medium friend from Tucson. So this one of those trips, Tina was saying to me, Mark, I think you're going to get a message. Will you share it with the congregation? And I said, well, sure. If I get something, I'll share it. And so she kept bugging me about this. So you promised to share it? Yes, I promise. And even the day walking into the church, she's like, Mark, if you get a message, will you share it? I'm like, yes. So we're about 30 minutes early. I go sit down in their healing room. I sit on a bench for a piano or an organ, and I try to quiet my mind. And actually, I'm able to get it like totally blank, which is pretty rare for me, much like the other experience I just described. But it's blank. I'm just sitting there, relaxing, trying to prep, just quiet my mind before the talk. But all of a sudden, a name pops into my mind, Max. And then immediately after, Maxine. I thought, oh, maybe it's Maxine or not Max. Now, I didn't hear it. I didn't see it. It came to me like an idea would come to you or a memory would come to you. That's it. It just popped in. So when it was my turn to talk, I gave the talk. And then at the end, I said, Tina made me promise to share anything I might get. So I have to ask if the names Max or Maxine mean anything to anyone here. And the pastor of the church, his jaw dropped, and he said, well, Max and Maxine were twins that were born to the church founder, Florence Becker. They were delivered stillborn and grew up in spirit. He said that only a few people, long-term church members, know this. And then he took me upstairs afterward to show me a painting that I believe was done by Florence Becker. It was a landscape with a winding road and two little figures at the end. He says, that's Max and Maxine. So first, now, in hindsight, I could say, now I know why Tina pushed me so hard to say that, because the way it came to me was so subtle that I could have just dismissed it as my imagination and gone on. But to have not one, but two names that aren't that common, together was pretty long odds. So that's how it worked for me. So I would say, I guess you could call that clairaudience, even though I didn't hear anything. It just popped in. Maybe it would be telepathy with the deceased.
Mm. In 1975, I was in the Air Force. I was stationed in Korea. And one morning I woke up and I heard in my head, and this is the way I get it, I get clairaudience, but I don't hear it as sound externally. I hear it within my head, a voice. And it said, you have to call your mother back in New York. There's something wrong and she needs to hear from you. And whenever that voice would speak to me, I would always respond in kind. I learned to differentiate between the ego voice, which is the voice that sort of shouts at you, and the softer voice, the reassuring voice that says, this is what you really need to do. And so consequently, I'd call back to New York, 6,000 miles away. And in those days, we had, as you know, extension telephones. And my sister and mother picked up the phone simultaneously. And I said, Mom, what's wrong? And I heard my sister say, oh, my God, how did he find out? And it turned out that she was scheduled for major surgery the next day. And the voice told me to share with her that the surgery would be a complete success. She'd have a full recovery and everything would be fine. And I shared that with her. Obviously, everything that I said transpired. And that conversation, that call, reassured her and made her feel really good. So that's one of the gifts of spirit that I'm grateful for, that inner voice that has guided me at many different times during my life. I think that every human being, every sentient being, has within them the capacity for some of these gifts. Do you?
Yeah, that was just like Socrates there. But
What
that's
about
awesome.
Socrates? I'm not familiar with that story.
Oh, just that he had a voice that always told him what to do and kept him out of trouble on the right path.
Ah, I didn't know that.
It was his daemon, but which is not the same as a demon.
Right.
But yeah, that he had a voice that always guided him to do what needed to be done to make the right decision. So yeah, but yeah, I do think that my dad felt that. I think everyone has this to some degree. The gifts are varied. I mean, some people maybe have healing gifts. Other people may have, an intuition. Some, and I think that this is broader too. Even like my dad felt the creative endeavors are closely related to some of these abilities, like music or art. So people that do those things, it kind of opens them up more. I just think that in terms of intuition, psychic abilities, mediumship, there's kind of you have X amount of natural aptitude, and I think some have more than others. Just like athletes, some athletes are better than others. Others make it to the pros through hard work. They're not as talented or gifted, but they can still get there. So I view it as like there's people that are the very best, and one of them that I know today is Gordon Smith, who's a medium out of Scotland. He's just phenomenal. He's the closest thing to my dad that I've seen. And then there are others that are very good, but I think his is a case of having a lot of natural aptitude, but also really training and development and commitment to it. Back in my dad's day, I think it was a different world. And the people that were in that area usually through spiritualism then, now it's broader, would work, they didn't have smartphones, they didn't watch TV, they had a lot more quiet time, and they were very dedicated. It took a lot of time and work to get to that point, and meditation. Eventually my dad figured out 2 meditations at 15 minutes a crack per day was really what worked for him. But I do think everybody has it to some degree. And even if you just use it to give yourself guidance, so you're not always seeking outwardly, asking for reassurance or guidance on what to do, you can hear that still inner voice that guides you to making good decisions. There's something to that. And I think it can benefit anyone.
Absolutely. My guest is Mark Ireland. We're going to be talking about his new book, The Persistence of the Soul, Mediums, Spirit Visitations, and Afterlife Communication. Mark, please share with our listeners that can get your books and find out more about you.
Yeah, my website has links to all the places that sell it, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and others, and it's available in 11 countries on Amazon. And my website is markirelandauthor.com. That's Mark with a K, Ireland like the country, and author, markirelandauthor.com.
And we'll be back with more of Mark after these words on the Om Times Radio Network.
The cutting edge of conscious radio, Om Times Radio, IOM FM. Om Times Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Om Times, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Mark Ireland. We're going to be talking about his new book, The Persistence of the Soul, Mediums, Spirit Visitations, and Afterlife Communication. Mark, tell us about your first book, Soul Shift.
Yeah, Soul Shift was really a recounting of the journey we talked about in the first segment, the journey I took after my son Brandon passed. It was kind of reintroducing myself to the field my father had been in, that I always saw and grew up with, but I don't want to say I abandoned, but I wasn't really engaged in it for quite a few years. And I think the first part I talk about Brandon and tell people what he was like and what he was all about. Very good kid, good-hearted, friendly towards people who weren't popular and all that. Just an old soul, I'd say, in terms of how you define people and what they're like. And so from there, I talked about, the day that he passed and then some of the experiences that happened after that. And then my introduction to 4 top mediums, my engagement with an experiment at the University of Arizona, who was testing mediums at the time. So I guess to get there, I'll give you a couple tidbits. So early on, I think 2 weeks after Brandon passed, I went to an intuitive, and one of the things she said was, I believe you're going to see Brandon at the side of your bed in about 6 months. So 6 months later, we did go on a cruise. So my wife and I, we took our older son, Stephen, and then we took Stu, who was Brandon's best friend. This was going to be Brandon's high school graduation gift to go on this cruise. But since he couldn't physically go with us, we took Stu. The day that we got back, now, I guess before I jump to that, before we left for the trip, we loaned Brandon's bass guitar, because Brandon was a bassist, to a friend named James Linton. James was a musician, guitar player, composer, singer, and he had an in-home studio. He was recording some music, and he asked if he could borrow the bass before we left. And so we did loan it to him. And we'd met James because he had actually been on the mountain the day Brandon passed. He had come to the area where Brandon was laying on his back and wanted to help, but he was too late. So he was really frustrated by that. And he told me that he asked God, like, well, why do you put me here in this situation? I can't even help this kid. So we found him because he had written a response on an online obituary and said that he had been there that day. And if we wanted to reach out to him, he gave us contact information. So anyhow, we became friends. We met him and became friends. And so this is, again, 6 months afterward, after Brandon's passing. We go on the cruise. We come back. The day that we're just as we get home, my wife is actually sitting at the foot of our bed, and she feels Brandon's presence. And she sees a shadow figure out of her peripheral vision that she knows is him. Now, here's what really makes the story even more compelling. The very next day, we get a call from James Linton. And he says, Susie, I've got something to tell you, but I don't know how to tell you. And she's like, well, she was afraid he'd broken the bass or something. But he says, well, I was recording a song, and while I was sitting there, I felt a presence in there with me. And I saw a shadow figure out of my peripheral vision. And I saw flashes of white light, and I thought I was hallucinating. So I went and got water, I got food, I took a shower, but each time I came back, it got stronger. Now, keep in mind, James didn't know about Susie's experience. He's just telling his experience at this point. He then finally gave in and said, okay, Brandon, what do you want? And he said at that point, he felt guided to redo the lyrics of this song and the bass line specifically. And at the end of it, it ended up being a song called The Other Side. He said, this is the best song I've ever written, but I didn't write it. So that was pretty compelling. That was one of the early experiences that happened. Another thing that kind of led me into the path of meeting some of the researchers in the field, and I'm friends with a few of them now. I know a few of them, as well as some top mediums. Going back to just 3 weeks after Brandon's passing, I was watching a news clip on the NBC affiliate in Phoenix about a research study being done at the University of Arizona, one of the few that would actually look into mediumship or psychic phenomena. And what they had going on there was they had a medium who was little known at the time, but later became a big name, Alison Dubois, because of the show Medium. She was being tested with some test sitters. Now, sitters are the people who receive the reading. And she couldn't see them visually, and they couldn't talk to her. But a third party, a proxy, was asking her questions. And she was doing really well, it appeared. And then at the end, they debriefed with the sitters. And I was really impressed because there was a lot of specific information, not just generalities, but specific information pertaining to people who had passed that were close to the sitters, and characteristics about them, what they like to do, where they like to go, all these kinds of things that were all validated. And I thought to myself, geez, I'd love to get a reading from her someday, and I'd love to be a sitter in that lab. Well, the very next day, I get a call from a man named Jerry Concert, who had been a close friend of my father's. And Jerry says to me, hey, Mark, I know what you've been through, and I know someone who might be able to help you. Her name's Alison Dubois, and here's the phone number you can call to get a reading from her. So that seemed rather synchronistic to me, like my dad was trying to help out from the other side. So I did eventually get that reading. And then a year later, I was in that lab as well as a test sitter with another medium, Lori Campbell. But I did go on and have a series of readings with Allison, with a man named Jamie Clark, with a prominent English medium, Linda Williamson, and then finally with Lori Campbell in the lab. So I chronicle all these different things that happen. There's a lot of synchronicity. There's a lot of validations in the readings, and a lot of the information overlapped. There was consistency there too. So it was that's kind of the long and short of what Soul Shift was about. It was a memoir, a personal journey that really brought me to a place of greater peace and understanding. And then subsequently, I know the book has been really healing for a lot of folks around the world. I've even had people write to me and say they had contemplated taking their own life, read the book, and then decided not to. They felt more hopeful and saw a purpose in life at that point, and that, they were better off not doing that.
And what inspired your new book, The Persistence of the Soul?
So this, it's really a blend of two things. I wanted to write a more scholarly book because I wanted to address some of these issues like extreme skepticism, which is really the debunker type of skepticism, which isn't open-minded skepticism. It's not really skepticism at all, because skepticism is supposed to be an open-minded inquiry to determine truth or following the evidence. So I wanted to address that. I also know that there were a lot of folks in more fundamentalist religious backgrounds who have a problem with these phenomena and are afraid of them because of maybe what they've been told or just traditional thinking within their churches. So I wanted to dive deeper and address that through looking at scripture and working through that. But I also wanted to keep the personal stories going too, like I had with Soul Shift. So it's a combination of two things. So it's really almost like two books in one. It's intended to be educational. So I'm giving personal stories and examples of various phenomena, supportive of the idea that our personality, our soul survives physical death, but then also the history and the science to support it where possible. So I go back and talk about the early cases through the Society of Psychical Research and some of the best evidence for this over the years, mingled with my personal experiences. I talk in there, I detail an experiment that I did with my sister Robin before her passing. I have a chapter touching on reincarnation as an issue. I interview two psychic mediums too, because a lot of people, if they get a reading or they hear a psychic medium talk about their experiences, the medium may say, "Oh, I see this," or "I'm being told this." But really, what does that mean? What's the experience like? So I dive deeper into that to get that firsthand experience from them. Like, well, what is this when you say you heard from spirit or you saw a spirit? What does that mean for you? So I get into that. So it's kind of a cross section of a scholarly book and a book of personal experiences. So if someone is more just, I don't care about the science, I just want to read the stories, they can skip just to those parts. Conversely, if someone's more just interested in the science and the scholarly part of it, they could just read that. And some people want to read it all. So that's really where that book came from. And I've had some really good endorsements from a number of people in the field. Stanley Krippner, who's been a parapsychologist for quite a few decades, Larry Dawsey, Alison Dubois, who I mentioned earlier, the late Guy Lyon Playfair, who was with the SPR, and a number of others. So that's what that book's about.
You had mentioned that experiment you conducted with your younger sister. Can you explain that process without giving away the outcome?
Sure, be happy to. So my sister had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, which metastasized to her liver. She had a finite period of time to be here on the earth in a physical body, probably a year or less. So as we were getting closer to the end, she was in hospice care. And I was thinking about, is there something we could do to help people have more confidence that life goes on after, physical death? So I thought about what kind of experiment we could do. And I kind of went back to the Houdini code. Now, a lot of people may or may not know this, but Harry Houdini was a debunker or tried to debunk mediums. But at the same time, he must have had some measure of believer in him, because he wanted to do an experiment by leaving a secret code with his wife, Beatrice, before he died. And he told her that if anyone should give you this phrase, that you'll know it's me and that I've made it, I still exist. And anyhow, after that, after his death, the medium Arthur Ford actually did deliver that phrase to her. But then skeptics came out of the woodwork claiming that they must have been in cahoots together and they just wanted the publicity, or some said it was a common knowledge what the phrase was. So all this stuff kind of blew it up. And if you were to Google this today, it would say that it's never been solved. But in fact, it was solved. But the debunker types got a hold of it and basically convinced people that it never was solved. So I asked myself, well, what was wrong with his methodology? Why did they come after him, and why didn't it hold up strong? And I thought to myself, really, because any living person knew what the phrase was. So they could allege that they had, the person had spilled the beans. So I thought to myself, well, a better way to do this is to have my sister write a phrase or a message of some sort and then put it into a sealed envelope where no one knows what it is except for her. And that's what we did. And then I consulted Dr. Don Watson. He's since passed too, but he was a neuroscientist who was very interested in these type of phenomena. And he helped me devise kind of an experimental method to try and pull this off. And we reached out to a number of mediums, told them about that, and asked who would like to participate. And then we started getting responses, and we put those together and categorized them. And then, further down, we eventually opened the envelope. He had asked me to send him the envelope so that I would never be implicated as having peeked at it or anything like that. So he got the envelope immediately. It was unsealed. My sister wrote on the outside. She initialed it. And when we opened it, then we compared all the responses to it. So it was an interesting process. And I think it could also give people ideas for other forms of types of experiments that could be done along these lines. And there's a learning, I think, whenever you do something like this, for how it could even be further enhanced.
What explains the debunker mentality? Why do debunkers want to debunk?
In my view, it's because of their worldview. They're married to a physicalist, materialistic paradigm that's been perpetuated in academia for a long, long time. It really goes back to, I think, the split between religion and science back at a time when scientists were being persecuted by the church. So that caused that split, and then there's never been a reconciliation. And unfortunately, a lot of those folks equate religion and spirituality with religion as one and the same, and they're not necessarily the same. So, and I think it's also comes out of a sense of arrogance, kind of like, oh, we're intellectually superior because we don't believe in all this woo-woo stuff. And it's a shame, because really we should be doing more research into this field. And there are some organizations and universities that do, which I applaud them, but I think we need a lot more. I mean, there's all kinds of research being done and things and spending our tax dollars on that aren't really that important to people. I don't know of any subject matter that's really any more important than, who are we? Why are we here? Where do we go after we die?
Right. We talk about the survival of consciousness and personality. And then we also talk about reincarnation. Is there a point where that communication with the consciousness and personality, that essence, the soul, the spirit, whatever you'd like to call it, goes on and can no longer be contacted?
This is speculative on my part, because I can't say that I know the answer. I think I kind of answer this one of two ways, or two possibilities. One, I've heard a theory that implies that part of us, maybe our oversoul, or the main part of us, it's always on the other side. It never comes here. We're like a subset of that soul, here for physical experiences in a physical world. And we're like, there's a feedback loop there that goes to our real soul, our eternal soul. And that's always there. It's never fully gone, if you will, or coming over here back and forth. The other thing is that, I think the duration of time on the other side in between incarnations may vary widely, and perhaps you're not coming back right away. On my dad, it felt like there were many cases where people might be on the other side for what we would consider on this side 100 years or thereabouts. I know other folks feel like reincarnation can happen very rapidly. So I don't really know the answer to that, but I've seen very few cases where someone could be contacted or couldn't communicate through a really top medium. So I'm kind of mixed on which view I take. Maybe the former, I might lean toward a little more than the latter.
Absolutely. My mother passed in January of 2020. And after she passed, I started seeing these visions of circles and rings in my mind's eye. And this poem came through me. May I share this with you?
Sure. I'd love to hear it.
It's called Circles and Rings, the path of great beauty in so many things, from atoms to galaxies, circles and rings, natural wisdom that dwells there within, from naught to 360, that magical spin. We circle each other in gravity's dance, as Gaia circles soul, the solar romance, as Luna circles us in life-giving motion, drawing the tides and inner emotion. And the age of the oak is found in its rings, as in woman and man and all living things. And when the rings stop and life comes to an end, we'll all circle back and dance once again.
You know what's really interesting about that? It's wonderful, beautiful. There's a friend of mine who lives in New York, Cullen Dorn. He's also an author, and he was friends with and mentored by another psychic medium, Clifford Bias, who was friends with my dad. I think my dad actually introduced them. But Cullen told me that Clifford had told, when Clifford was near dying, I think he said, "We shall dance again."
That's wonderful. That confirms the sense that I had. That's wonderful. Yeah. My guest is Mark Ireland. His book, The Persistence of the Soul, Mediums, Spirit Visitations, and Afterlife Communication. We'll be back with more after these words on the Om Times Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Mark Ireland. His book, The Persistence of the Soul, Mediums, Spirit Visitations, and Afterlife Communication. Mark, why did you start a medium certification program?
Well, after my first book came out, I was kind of being barraged with people asking for recommendations for mediums, for good mediums. And what I'm talking about are evidential mediums, ones that just don't tell you your grandmother loves you and things like that, but provides detailed information. And so anyhow, as a result of that, I knew at that point just maybe a half dozen people that were really good, but a lot of them were celebrities at that point, had long wait lists, some up to 2 years, and some charged more. You know, I'm not going to judge people what they charge. It's great for some people to not charge anything or charge very little, and others charge more. But you know, some of those folks quit careers too in the business world just to support themselves so they could do it full time. But I thought, well, it would be nice to make it accessible to more people. So I thought, you know, there must be other folks out there with these abilities that are refined that just aren't well known and don't charge a lot and don't have long wait lists. So I put together a plan to develop protocols and have a program to test mediums and have them earn certification. And to that end, I participated in a mediumship research project or experiment with Dr. Emily Williams Kelly at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. That's the same department that was founded by Dr. Ian Stevenson, who is a reincarnation researcher. And Dr. Bruce Grayson works there as well, primarily has been focused on near-death experience phenomena. Jim Tucker now picked up where Ian Stevenson left off on the reincarnation research. But anyhow, through the process of working on this experiment, a mediumship experiment with Dr. Kelly, I learned what her protocols were. So I kind of used those as a guideline. And then another friend of mine, Tricia Robertson, who had been the president of the Scottish Society of Psychical Research, helped me kind of refine those. And so what I ended up putting together was a process of where any applicant has to conduct 5 blinded readings via Zoom with no video on for someone they don't know. The sitter, the recipient of the reading, would provide their first name only at the beginning, and again, no video. They can turn video on later, but not in the beginning. And then the medium has to give the reading for about the first 10 minutes. They just give whatever impressions come. And then if the sitter wants, they can ask for a connection with a specific first name only. So this is all recorded. And then at the end, the sitter is charged with transcribing it and then grading it. And the way that works is the sitter will have to take, say if there's a paragraph worth of information, they need to break that into individual statements that can be validated as correct, incorrect, or indeterminable. And if something's correct and it's highly significant to the sitter, they can award bonus points. And there's 2 levels of that. There's a 2-point bonus and a 5-point bonus. So for example, let's say the medium says to the sitter, I believe I have your son here. His name starts with an A, and I think his favorite food was pizza. The sitter might say, okay, well, those 3 things are correct. My son passed. His name was Aaron, so that's an A name. That's good. And pizza was his favorite food. So maybe they'd say, okay, that's pretty good. I'm going to give a bonus point for the pizza and for the A name. But if the medium says, I believe I have your son here, his name is Aaron, and he liked pizza with anchovies, black olives, and green peppers, that's highly specific. And then the sitter would probably not only call those correct, but give 5-point bonuses for those 2 statements. So that kind of gives you a feel for how it works. But at the end of the day, once these 5 are conducted, it's the overall result that the passing requirements are to have a score of 75 or better as a minimum. And what that consists of is the percent accuracy is part of the number. So in other words, 65% is the minimum that one they have to be at least 65% accurate to pass. And then with enough bonus points, they could hit 75. So for example, let's say somebody was 65% accurate and they had 2 5-point bonuses and they got 75 points, they would pass just barely, but that would be a passing grade. Or someone's 75 or 76% accurate with no bonuses, they could pass as well. Now, the indeterminable statements get pushed to the side. Those would be things like predictions of things that haven't passed yet, or maybe a piece of information the sitter can't determine. Maybe it was pertaining to someone that their loved one knew in Europe or whatever, and they have no contact information for the person, so they can't validate the statement. But I limit the indeterminables to 33% of all statements. If somebody exceeds that, then to me, it's really not a good reading. So any of those over 33% get cast into the incorrect bucket. And today, this is, I started this in 2014, so 9.5 years later, I've got about 40 people who have been certified and some really good ones. I mean, some have scored in the 95 to 98% range, or not percent, but 95 to 98 point range. And some with accuracies, in the high 80s to low 90s too. So, and then I've done this all on my own. It's, I don't make any money from it. I don't collect a dime. It's just linking. It's a public service thing, linking resources to people who need them so that folks can go to a credible source. There's no guarantee that they're going to get a good reading, but the odds are greatly improved, and they're going to somebody who's trustworthy. And in most of these mediums too, if a sitter gets a substandard reading, they'll get a refund if they ask for it. So that's really why it's there.
Please tell us about the Helping Parents Heal HPH organization and how it was founded.
Sure. So the way it came together was back in 2009, 2010, I was promoting my first book and I was doing some workshops. And this particular workshop, we had a break and a woman approached me during the break and she said, "Hey, I'm Suzanne Wilson. I just moved from Florida to Arizona and I came here to meet like-minded people." And in the course of what she was describing to me, she goes, interestingly, I met another mother whose son had passed on a mountain. It was in the Himalayas that he was on a school trip, and they had apparently taken the bus up the mountain too rapidly, and he ended up dying of altitude sickness. But she had told me about this other mother, and apparently the way she came to meet her was rather interesting because she was trying to rent office space so she could have clients come in there. And then the landlord didn't really know what a medium was or whether it was believable. So she put her through a test. And the test was one where the landlord showed a card, like a greeting card, a holiday or Christmas card to Suzanne and said, tell me something about the people on this. And the card really featured 3 young people, 2 girls and a boy, or young adults on there. Well, it was the young man who had passed. She didn't know that, but she said, well, this young man, I feel his presence. And then she shared a number of validations that were pretty interesting. One of which was she saw him with a blowhorn, another, a big teddy bear. Well, it turned out that the son, Morgan, had been a cheerleader for the University of Arizona football team, and he used a blowhorn. And the cheerleaders called him Big Bear because of his big bear hug. So the big teddy bear, made sense there. There were probably half a dozen or more validations like that. Those are the ones I remember. Anyhow, so I told Suzanne, I said, you know what? Here's a copy of my book. Why don't you give this to the mother who had the son pass? And here's my contact information. So it was no more than a day or two later, I got a call from Elizabeth Boyson, who's now the president of Helping Parents Heal. And she said, I read your book in one sitting. I want to meet you and your wife. And so we did meet really soon thereafter. And she says, well, I started a group called Parents United in Loss on Facebook. But I'm going to have my first ever in-person meeting. Would you like to be my first speaker? And I said, okay, sure. So a while later, we went to this meeting. I think she drew maybe 30 or 40 people, something like that. It went really well, and I could see that it was very therapeutic for people. And then she started doing these meetings every month. Fast forward to late 2011, I was leaving a corporate job and talking to my friend Tina Powers, who I'd mentioned earlier in the interview. And Tina said to me, Mark, I think your real purpose in life is to help other parents who have been through the same thing you have. Why don't you think about if you could start some sort of organization to do that? I said, okay. So I was mulling it over and I thought, you know what, why reinvent the wheel? What Elizabeth put together works. The only limitation is that it's just one location and she doesn't have a website. She doesn't have a newsletter. So I thought to approach her, I called her and said, hey, Tina gave me this feedback and I think she's on to something here. Would you like to partner with me and kind of blow this thing out and make it something bigger where we could blueprint what your process is and take it out to other locations, other cities, and have more of these types of meetings? And also I'll help put a website together and we'll start a newsletter. And she said, that'd be great. And I said, and maybe we could, use a new name like Helping Parents Heal. She says, I love that name. I didn't like my name, Parents United in Loss. It sounded too depressing. And the reason why we really started this was because there have been and still are other parent support groups for grieving parents, but they don't allow the discussion of afterlife evidence or spiritual experiences. So that was our differentiator. And now fast forward to 2023, we have 176 affiliate chapters around the world. We have 26,000 members, and we will have our third conference in 2024 in August that will draw 1,000 people. We had one last year that drew 900, sold out the hotel. And interestingly, the hotel staff were really concerned about having a group of bereaved parents there. They were afraid that it was going to be a real downer and depressing. And at the end of it, they said, you were the best group we've ever had. And it was so uplifting. I had half a dozen people approach me and say, thank you so much. Now, I don't know if they're talking about my books or about the organization, but they said, you saved my life. And that kept happening again and again and again. I just saw people that were in a really dark place when they got there that were really uplifted. And quite frankly, there's a lot more participation of women than men. But since we had this conference, the women brought their husbands. So a lot of the husbands were exposed to things that they hadn't considered before, and they got some healing out of it too. And we really have some top-notch presenters there too. We had Mark Anthony, Suzanne Giesman. This next one, we're still going to have those two. Plus, we're going to have Gordon Smith back, Suzanne Wilson, Dr. Mary Neal, and a lot of other people. Really, really good lineup. So that's what started with this little nugget to this massive organization today that's really providing a lot of healing for folks around the world.
The wonderful work of Mark Ireland. His latest book, The Persistence of the Soul, Mediums, Spirit Visitations, and Afterlife Communication. Mark, one more time, please tell our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about this wonderful work.
Yeah, if you just go to my website, it's markirelandauthor.com. Mark with a K, Ireland like the country, author, markirelandauthor.com. Not only will you find my books there, I have a media tab, and you could see other interviews. You could see the clip of the Discovery Channel show when I was at the University of Arizona participating in a research study there. You could see a short documentary that was done on my story. There is a link on my page to the Helping Parents Heal website. There's also a link to see the video of my dad on the Steve Allen show back in 1971, and some other clips of him as well. And then there's also a link to the Certified Medium site. So everything is there that you might want that we've talked about today. markirelandauthor.com.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this very special message.
Sure thing, Victor. It's been my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Furman. Have a wonderful week.